Right, good morning, everyone. My name is Jason Lassard, and I'm an intellectual property specialist from HGF. In this talk, my colleague, Jennifer Bailey, and I are going to try to give you a bit of a different perspective on IP. This webinar is being recorded, and I understand that it's available from the organizers. So if you miss anything, then you should be able to just get a copy of the recording afterwards. Please can you put your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat box. We'll try to make sure that we answer all of them, but for anyone who has any questions that aren't answered, feel free to get in touch with Jenny or I, say by email. I'm going to kick things off and I'll answer some questions that come up in the first half of our talk. I'll then hand over to Jenny for the second half. We're going to focus on new product development. Anyone who's ever been involved in developing new products knows that it's expensive and risky. No matter how well you think you know your customers, you're never quite sure whether it'll be a success. The cost and speed of making prototypes and low volume runs is improving all the time. So you can actually get products in the hands of your customers very quickly now, and without too much investment. Methods like Lean Startup and Agile can also help manage the risks. The idea is to either fail fast or come up with something that customers actually want as efficiently as possible. This leads some people to question whether IP systems are still fit for purpose, and that's what we're going to focus on. I'm going to run through some IP basics, but really only enough to give you context for this topic. Since this is Birmingham Tech Week, we're going to focus on technology companies with less emphasis on designs and branding. People often miss the distinction between intellectual property and the rights that protect them. In its broadest sense, IP encompasses any creation of the mind that's used in commerce. IP rights, on the other hand, are the legal rights that protect them. For example, an invention is a form of IP, while a patent is a right that actually protects the invention. These legal rights cover some types of creations, but not others. Some rights are automatic, like copyright, for example, while others require registration, like patents, designs, and trademarks. These are often referred to as negative rights, because although they give the owner the right to stop others from using them, they don't necessarily give the owner the freedom to exploit them. Most creations of the mind build on something that's come before. This means that your IP will often incorporate someone else's. In other words, exploiting your own ideas can infringe someone else's rights. Securing IP rights won't ensure your success any more than building a better mousetrap. They are just business tools that enable you to protect what makes you different. They don't really have any inherent value like most physical property does. So if an IP right gives you no commercial advantage, then it's probably not worth investing in. IP and IP rights are intangible assets. In tech companies, they're often the most valuable ones. Intangible assets account for the majority of the value in the most successful businesses. This graph shows the split between tangible and intangible assets for the Standard & Poor's 500 over the past 45 years. As you can see, it's increased dramatically. So even though IP is complicated and slippery, it's essential if you want to build a successful business. Not all forms of IP will be relevant to your business, and in some cases, it's better just not to register anything. In this talk, though, we're going to focus on, in the main, on registered IP rights. The first of these is patents. Patents protect technology. This can be functional product features, new processes, chemical compounds, and so on. If it's technical, then you should always consider patents. The trickiest part about them is that you have to apply before you tell anyone about it. The exception is if a person that you tell is under an obligation to keep it secret, usually by a signed agreement. The scope of a patent is defined by its claims, and these claims summarize what's different about the invention. This summary can be changed and refocused as long as the application hasn't granted yet and as long as it was in the original text somewhere. Another helpful feature of patents is that you can file updates to the application for the first 12 months. It can even refocus the scope, or sorry, you can even refocus the scope of what you're trying to protect. But a complete pivot might actually make the original application obsolete. But the key to optimizing costs with patents is to know what the context is. What's new about the invention? What's likely to change? What's already known from other patents? And do any of those older patents conflict with what you're trying to do? All too often, companies jump straight into launching a product without considering these questions. Even companies that do file patents don't always do any searching beforehand. The more you know, the better you can plan, and the more you plan, the less money you will waste on IP. This is true not only of patents, but for all IP registrations. Design registrations protect visual features. This can be individual parts of a product or the entire thing. In most countries, applications aren't examined like patents are. This makes them much less expensive. So you can create a real minefield by protecting novel features separately, individual novel features, that is, and in different combinations. And you can do all of this at a relatively low cost. Designs need to be novel, similar to patents, but there's a 12-month grace period in many countries like the UK, the EU, and the US. This allows you to test the market before you actually register them. Some countries, though, like China, for example, don't offer this grace period, so you need to be careful. Launching without filing might also create other risks, so it's always best to file before you disclose. The main downside of design registrations is that they only cover designs that are nearly the same, so they're fairly easy to design around. Creating a minefield by registering individual features, like I mentioned before, makes this much more difficult. Another downside is that you can't change the focus once it's been filed. Even small changes can make the product fall outside the registration. Again, though, protecting individual features mitigates this downside. So basically, if we compare patents and designs, with patents, you've got more flexibility to shift the scope of what it is that you're protecting, whereas with designs, you've got this grace period that allows you to test the market before you file anything. Trademarks protect branding. This type of registration is the one that most people are familiar with. Unlike patents and designs, you don't need to file before you start using your brand. In fact, if your brand is a little bit descriptive, then building a reputation first can actually help you get a brand through registration. The protection that you get from a trademark is also quite broad. It covers marks that are confusingly similar, and in some cases, these can look quite different from the mark that's actually registered. It also covers situations where similar marks are being used on goods or services that aren't necessarily the same as or covered by your registration, as long as it's likely that customers will be confused. You can register a trademark for as many goods and services as you like, and you normally have a grace period to use it. In the UK and the EU, this is 5 years. What that means is that you can file for a broad range of products that you think you might sell in the next 5 years. So if you think you might change your focus or even pivot, you can hedge your bets when you register. The other aspect is, as I said, even if your registration doesn't necessarily cover the specific products that you end up making, it may still be covered because your registration does cover use of marks on similar products where there's a likelihood of confusion. The broader you cast your net, though, the more likely you are to encroach on someone else's registration. So if you file an application that covers loads and loads of goods and services, this gives them the opportunity to oppose your application, which can be costly. As I explained before, knowing the context is key for trademarks as well. Trademark clearance searching is not that expensive, and it can save you a lot of embarrassment and wasted marketing budget. Moving on to the product development trends that I touched on earlier, two of the most popular ones that I've come across are the lean startup and Agile. Both of these are based on the understanding that companies don't always know what our customers want. And often, the customers themselves don't know what they want. Both of these approaches focus on experimentation, adjusting, testing, adjusting, and testing again. With lean startup, the focus is on getting a minimum viable product out as swiftly as you can to test your hypotheses. You then revisit and adjust your assumptions and keep experimenting. With each iteration, you reassess whether to persevere or whether you should pivot and change things around completely. In Agile, you break a product down into blocks. Then you involve all the stakeholders in speccing out that block, developing and testing it, and then reassessing before taking on the next block. The product specification, therefore, evolves over time. Disruptive innovation is a little bit different. It involves redefining value chains and displacing existing market players. It usually requires mass adoption and flooding the market to shock competitive dynamics. Exclusivity is often seen as a barrier to mass adoption, so IP rights can be counterintuitive. However, ignoring IP would be a naive strategy. IP rights can likely be, IP rights are likely to be the key to protecting at least some of your competitive advantages. On the face of it, there seem to be some fundamental contradictions between these trends and IP systems. The most stark contradiction is that you would expect to need complete freedom to encourage something like mass adoption. The exclusivity that forms the basis of any IP right seems to contradict this. But it's not that straightforward. Take Tesla, for example. Elon Musk famously opened his patent portfolio to encourage mass adoption of their technology. Not only did they benefit from the publicity, but it also provided Tesla with other less direct benefits. In addition to the great PR that they received, it also encouraged competitors to reciprocate. And if competitors reciprocate, then Tesla can benefit from their technology. Musk's qualifier that Tesla would not assert their patents against anyone who acts in good faith is also not an accident, since it keeps some enforcement options open. If Tesla's technology becomes the standard, the company also stands to benefit from a bigger market and consequential growth of sales in batteries from their gigafactory. So this apparent contradiction is not so clear-cut. Another problem is the idea of filing before disclosure in patents and designs. This seems to lead to a conflict between experimenting and protecting your IP. It's not always practical or affordable to protect every iteration. Linked to this is the need for flexibility. IP systems are built on certainty. What you file is what you want to protect. But as I explained, this too is more nuanced. There is flexibility in the system. You just need to know how to use it and where its boundaries lie. This leads us on to strategy. As I explained before, IP rights are only as valuable as the commercial advantages that they protect. Just because you can protect something doesn't mean that you should. IP registrations are expensive, so you need to focus your budget where it counts. Your IP strategy should support your competitive position. It should help you achieve your commercial objectives, but your commercial strategy goes hand in glove with your IP strategy, and you should develop both of them together. You might find that some small changes or tweaks to your commercial approach can have a massive impact on your options for IP protection. There are also some ways to play the system to give you more flexibility and to delay costs. Jenny's going to run through some of the common commercial strategies for bringing new technologies to market. She'll give you some examples of how you can tweak your approach so that you can get the balance right. But first, I'll just have a quick look at the Q&A so far. Right, so what is the best way to protect software? This is a good question. It's not an easy one to answer though. The official position is that you can't patent software, but in reality, the reality really is that most technology has at least some software element to it. The law recognizes this, so software that incorporates something that's technical can actually be patented. One example that I usually give is that software that controls traffic lights can be patented, as long as the way in which it controls the traffic lights is novel in and of itself and it makes traffic flow better. But for example, software that just allocates, say, pension benefits in some novel way, then that wouldn't be patentable. This is an entire topic on its own. So if you'd like to discuss something specific, then do please get in touch offline. So now I'll just hand over to Jenny.
Thanks, Jason. Can I just check you can see my screen okay?
I can.
Great. Okay, so just following on really from what Jason's been talking about, something that we hear is business advisors sometimes presenting an IP strategy as a sort of alternative to other business models. And this is a graphic that we've taken from an edition of Harvard Business Review that was published a couple of years ago. And this is a model that gives entrepreneurs and new ventures 4 different options for developing their business. These are an intellectual property strategy whereby the business protects the IP and then licenses it out, for example, using the model used by Dolby. Business could follow an architectural model where they create a whole new value chain or a new platform like Google. There's a classic disruption model, or there's a value chain strategy, which is about collaborating with existing players. And the authors of the article present these different strategic options on this kind of matrix, and they invite the entrepreneur or the new company to consider which of them to follow using 2 main questions. So the first question is, does the company want to collaborate or does it want to compete? And the second one is, does it want to build a moat, which means protect the IP, or does it want to concentrate on getting a product to the market quickly and encouraging mass adoption, which is storm a hill? Now, the problem with this type of strategy is that it really pigeonholes IP into a single box and makes out that it's contrary to experimentation, to mass adoption, to being competitive. Whereas actually we kind of disagree with that premise, because we think that protecting IP actually enables control. And even if you decide to relinquish some of that control, like in the Tesla model that Jason discussed earlier, then it still gives you the option of where you want to take the business in the future. Protecting IP, for example, branding is probably key to operating in all of the other quadrants on this graphic. And in addition, protecting IP actually puts you in a better position to compete with other companies. So it's not just allowing you to collaborate, but it actually enables you to compete as well. So like Jason was saying, there is this fundamental tension though that exists between experimenting and new product development, but also protecting the IP that goes with that, particularly in the case of patents, because once you've put your idea out there and tested it on the market, then you can no longer protect it. So there's quite a difficult question to answer, which is, when do you file your patent application? So at one extreme, you could file an application early on when your product is in really the early stages of development, you might have very little data and no working prototype. And the risk, of course, of filing quite early on is that any patent application you file might not quite capture the final version of the product. So it might not have the correct focus. But at the same time, an early filing can give you some security so that you can go out and talk to investors and talk to collaborators. At the other end of the spectrum, you may delay filing until quite late on after you've done your experimentation and refined your product and collected lots of data. And the reward of doing it that way is that your patent application can be really focused on the product that you're actually going to launch on the market. But the risk, of course, is that your competitors might beat you to it. And during the experimentation process, your IP might leak out into the public, which could undermine your chances of getting a patent. Now, some companies are in a good position in that they can basically cover the whole of this continuum. They can file something speculative early on, but then as their product develops, they can perhaps file updates and make new applications. But that approach is quite costly. So something that startups and SMEs might consider is aiming to be somewhere in the middle, where you've done enough experimentation to figure out what your invention is about and what your product is likely to look like, and then get your IP on file that captures the most value. So how do you go about experimenting without giving away your valuable IP? Now, there are some different ways you can go about that. One is to test your product internally, just within the company. And that's probably the safest option. But if you need to get customer feedback or test your product with lots of different people, then that model might not work for you. Another option is to test minimum viable products that are based on old patents. And in that way, it means that you're testing old technology and you can be sure that you're not actually releasing anything new into the public domain. And from the data that you gather from those tests, then you can implement your new invention on top of that. In a similar way, you can test components of a new device that are not actually central to the underlying invention. So, for example, you might test a user interface and get feedback from customers on whether they like to use that without giving away the tech behind that interface. Another example is testing under controlled conditions in a way that doesn't allow access to the testers to the underlying tech. So let's say you've developed a new beverage composition. You could invite test subjects in to try it out and give you some feedback on the product, but don't allow them to take away a sample so that they can't reverse engineer it. And then finally, another option is to test under non-disclosure agreements, which prevent people from sharing your invention. Now, the problem with NDAs is they're not bulletproof. So people might still go away and share your invention with the rest of the world, and they could also file their own patent application based on your technology, which can lead you in a very difficult situation. So as you move down those options, the risk does increase. So really, when you're developing a new product and you need to experiment, you need to kind of balance those risks against the rewards and work out the best way of getting the information that you need in order to file a patent application that captures the most value. So rather than just thinking about IP in terms of your own rights and what you may or may not be able to protect, the patent literature is also a really valuable source of technical information that you can use to your advantage. Patent applications are published 18 months from filing, after which they are freely available. So you can review other patent applications and granted patents that are out there and see how other people have solved similar technical problems, either in your own field or related field, or even remote technical fields. And that can be a way of stimulating new ideas. And you could also use the data in those patent applications to save some of your own experimentation. Another useful feature about the patent literature is that you can use it to identify gaps where competitors don't have any IP rights and white space that you might be able to occupy yourself. So I've put on the slide the link to Aspasnet, which is the European Patent Office's own patent database that's free to use, and you can search millions of patent documents using a combination of keywords and classifications. So returning to something Jason was talking about earlier is designs, and the extent to which you can experiment if you're thinking about getting a design registration. So designs do allow some experimentation in the grace period, as Jason explained earlier, but it's important to consider which markets you're interested in first. So if you're interested in launching your product in China, which doesn't have a grace period, then you want to make sure that you don't do any experimenting in the public domain before you get your application on file. So consider where you might want to market your product, work out your IP strategy, and then do your experiments after you've taken all those factors into consideration. In terms of trademarks, like Jason said, there isn't really this same tension between experimenting and protection that we see in patents. So you can pretty much file them when you like, but something that's a good idea to do is a clearance search before you launch your brand. So that could be in order to work out which marks are available for you to use without infringing other people, and also what you might be able to get registered yourself. And a good example of when clearance search could be really useful is a client of mine who had a new business venture a couple of years ago. They spent a lot of money designing some signage for a new facility, and they kitted out their staff with some uniforms with their branding all over it. And then they realized that the brand and the logo they had chosen would probably infringe lots of other people's trademarks. So they had to ditch all that branding, get rid of the signs, and have everything remade to quite a big cost. So a bit of clearance searching before you start can really save some headaches later on. Something to consider with trademarks is, while there isn't the issue of disclosure, it's still worth putting some thought into the timing of filing. So if you have a really effective brand and you haven't registered it yet, then there is always the risk that a competitor might see that you're onto a good thing and beat you to it. At the same time, if your branding is quite descriptive of your product or service, then it can be a bit more difficult to obtain a registered trademark, in which case using the branding in the marketplace for some time can help you to build up a reputation and acquire distinctiveness, which can then support an application for registration. So turning to another of the kind of contradictions that Jason touched on earlier is this question of flexibility. Sometimes it's perceived that IP rights are not very flexible and the system is very rigid. And while it's perhaps true to some extent that the legal framework in which registered IP is obtained and enforced can be quite rigid and is probably unlikely to change a whole lot, the way that you capture and use IP rights is actually quite flexible. So taking patents as the first example, when you have a new product that you're thinking about launching, you can file an application that's quite broad in scope in order that you capture variations of the product that you consider might be developed later on. And as Jason mentioned earlier, as you refine your product and do experiments, then you can update your application over the next 12 months to incorporate new features and new iterations. If you have a granted patent, but you find that you're not using the whole scope of it, one option is to license portions of it out, and that enables you to generate some income. Patents for platform tech can be incredibly valuable. So an example of that is diagnostics. If you've got a new diagnostic kit or a new kind of test device, then you could get quite a narrow patent that protects how that device works. But the patent would still cover any use of that technology. So for example, the use of the diagnostic test in healthcare, so diagnosing diseases, or looking for impurities in soil samples or other environmental applications or food safety. So even quite a narrow patent to a particular technology can actually be very valuable in that it covers lots of different applications of that tech. What happens if you decide to do a complete U-turn and change the course of your technology entirely? Well, you've got the option of selling or licensing patents like any other type of property, or you can withdraw them. In terms of certainty, it's always really difficult to predict whether you'll get a patent granted and what the scope of any granted patent might be. And something that you can do early on to help you is a bit of due diligence, which means having a search of the patent literature, but also non-patent literature to see what other people have done before. And that will help give you an idea about what can be protected, what's worth trying to protect, but also what features of your tech are known that you can release into the public domain without worrying about losing IP rights. Going back to designs, in some ways these are a bit less flexible than patents, as Jason touched on earlier, in that you can't update an application after you filed it. But one way that designs can be flexible is that they allow you to protect a piece of the whole. So for example, if you've designed a new chair, you could register the design of the leg or the arm or the back piece, and that then allows you to modify other parts of the design while still being protected. Another great feature of design registrations is that they're relatively low cost. So that allows you to capture different aspects of a single design or different variants of the design without breaking the bank. Trademarks are also quite flexible in that you can protect the word mark, so just the name without any stylization of your brand, or you could protect a logo either in black and white or color. And the great thing about that is if you then change your logo or you change your colors, then the underlying word mark can still provide protection for your brand. Like Jason said earlier, trademarks can be protected across a wide range of goods and services. So if you're not quite sure which area of the market your tech might apply in, then in the beginning you could register your trademark across a whole range of goods and services, and then see how the market responds to your product and refine the goods and services later on. As a final point, it's worth considering when you design your branding in the beginning, how broad you want to be with the branding in order to allow pivots in the future. So you might not want to design branding that limits you to a particular sector of the market. And an interesting example of this is a story I read about a few weeks ago about a virtual reality company. And they designed this VR headset, and all their branding was around creating this magical universe and, you know, stretching your imagination. And it was a kind of really delightful branding exercise. But the VR technology didn't take off quite as well as the company hoped, and they had to pivot and instead sell the tech to the military. Now, this meant that all their branding that they had developed initially became obsolete, and it also became a really hard sell to investors because the company had switched from delightful consumer tech, all about imagination and fantasy worlds, to lethal military gear. And that was quite difficult for their investors to swallow. So perhaps if they'd branded their tech using some more generic branding initially, just focused on VR generally rather than the specific use of the VR, then that could have allowed them to cover all of their options from the start. So just to briefly summarize, our view is that rather than being a strategy sat on its own, an IP strategy can actually support agile businesses, lean startups, disruptors, collaborative and competitive businesses. And to capture the most value, it's all about how you use IP. So the best thing you can do is to think about how IP can work for your business from the very beginning and tailor an IP strategy that works for you. And in the same way as the lean startup model is about testing and refining and redesigning a product, a lean IP strategy should be all about settling on an IP strategy and moving forwards with it, but also keep reevaluating it and adapting it as the business changes. So that's the end of my slides. So thank you very much for listening. And I think we've probably got time for a few questions. Okay, so one question that's come in is, when is it better to keep an idea as a trade secret rather than protecting it with a patent application? So there's a few aspects to consider here. One is about what's the nature of the technology, how long is it important to retain protection for? So patents last for 20 years, and the problem is then after that 20 years expires, then the tech is out there for the public to use freely. So if it's important to you to protect an idea for longer than 20 years, then a patent might not be the best way to do it. But of course, in a lot of tech at the moment, it moves quite quickly. So really, you might not be concerned about what happens in 20 years, and actually protection may only be worthwhile in the much shorter term, in which case a patent probably is more valuable. Another question with trade secrets is it going to be actually possible to keep them a secret? So that really depends on the type of tech and also how confident you are that the tech is not going to leak out of the company. Trade secrets can work really well for things like technical processes like manufacturing, where it's when you look at the final product, you can't work out how it's been made. And in some cases, for compositions of matter where it's not possible to reverse engineer a product and work out what it's been made from by analyzing it. But there's always going to be a risk. And even if you have a product now that's not possible to engineer, you know, analytical techniques move on, and in 10 years' time, it may be that that product can be reverse engineered. So quite often patents are stronger than trade secrets, but there are definitely quite a lot of factors to balance up when you're considering which route to follow. Jason, do you have any comments to add to that?
No, I think that that covers everything. As Jenny said, thanks everyone for participating. And as I said before, if you have any questions, any follow-up questions, or if you're watching this recording and you'd like to you'd like to have some questions answered, please feel free to send us an email. It's on the first and last, our email addresses are on the first and last slide. So as I said, yes, please do get in touch, and thanks everyone for joining us.